exploring the best camping spots with their pop-up camper. Sam goes to therapy, loves fly fishing, and can often be found catching his breath on the floor of the local CrossFit gym. Today, he's here with us to talk about his new book, The Sex Talk You Never Got, Reclaiming the Heart of Masculine Sexuality. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
It's so fun when my people get to, the listeners get to meet my people, because Sam's one of my people. His wife is one of my dearest friends. And this book is phenomenal. I'm like super excited to talk about it. I'm just going to tell our listeners, part of the reason this book is phenomenal is not just is it well written and well thought through and has really good stuff, but it's also because of the character behind the book, and that's you, Sam. So I'm just thankful for you. Maybe to start out, tell us, what led you to write this book?
Yeah, well, ultimately what led me to write the book is I have 3 sons, and I was thinking about, oh my goodness, what am I going to convey to my sons about sexuality? And my sons are, one of them is just turning 13 this summer. So, this was when they were younger, when I started kind of thinking about the book. But the sense of like, what do you tell? What's the vision here for male sexuality? What's a good vision for male sexuality that, obviously kind of coming out of the Me Too movement, there was also some inspiration for right? Everybody was sitting in the horror of like, wow, this is way pervasive. The impact of male sexuality on people's lives. And obviously I have a window into that just from sitting in a counseling office with people. But I think kind of the whole world was asking, like, is male sexuality just broken? Is there a redemptive way to embody this? At least that was my question as a man. And obviously out of my own life journey as a man, like trying to embody well sexuality and, knowing like, okay, God called this good in Eden, right? We have that. And what's the good here? Like what's the vision other than, and then obviously coming as well, I grew up in the church. And so I probably had purity culture medium. It wasn't purity culture heavy, but enough of it to, have the embodied experience of like, don't lust is kind of the vision, right? Stay pure. And realizing even that fell short of like, that's it. That's just stay pure. So those kind of forces converged together, and I was spurned on primarily by the Me Too movement. I think that's what finally made me feel like something's got to be said here. Like,
you write this book basically kind of explaining that there's two ways to embody sexuality. And my guess is like the whole YouTube movement kind of opened up so many people's eyes to men aren't just animals. I mean, I think a lot of times that's how they're portrayed, as just like being a savage and that type of thing. And you kind of give this other piece of like, they can also be a lover. And maybe could you just double click on that, explain a little bit more about these 2 different ways that we kind of embody sexuality?
Well, so again, I call it being the savage, and it's an attempt at using sort of mythic language for this image of the monster, right? Like, and I've had men sit with me in counseling and even say that of themselves, right? Like, I feel like, maybe they're caught in some sort of sexual struggle or an affair or something. And they've said, man, I feel like I'm just fundamentally broken, or I'm a monster, right? Like, and I think that's even somewhat the understandable image of male sexuality coming out of the Me Too movement, where I think the statistics are 90% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by men. That is staggering to me. 90+%. And sexual violence, sexual abuse. So, there's this sense of like, man, it can be very savage in the world. There's no question about that. But is it fundamentally savage? And I was wrestling with,
Hmm.
this sense of like, what are the most, if you look at the Bible and ask the question, what are the pictures of the most virile men in the Bible, right? In a good way. Obviously you can find the savage in the Bible. Certainly that's there. But like, what does the Bible seem to set up as this good picture of virile, sexually alive men? And I thought of Adam naked in the garden meeting Eve, and Song of Songs, right? As these two pictures. And obviously you might argue with me of like, are those the pictures, right? But those were two that jumped out to me, right? And the picture is of these two men that are, clearly in Song of Songs, this is a man who is sexually aroused. There's mention of an ivory tusk in the description of his body, right? We don't have to use too much imagination there, but there's a sense of this is a sexually virile man. Adam meeting Eve, right? They're naked and without shame. And again, I don't know what went on in Adam's interior, but to mark that, again, some sense that there was probably arousal, at least a general body arousal in meeting Eve. But what do they do? Where does their virility, their arousal lead them? Right? The very first thing it leads them to is to write poetry. Right? They break out in poetry. It's not just right to a kind of violating or kind of grasping sexuality. There's certainly a pining after their beloved. But it first leads them to poetry. So something of saying like, whoa, that's fascinating. Now, I'm not necessarily saying every man needs to become a poet, every time he's aroused to write a poem or something. But nevertheless, it's fascinating to me that, what is that? Why are these men breaking into poetry around their sexuality? And that brought me to the image of the lover, that, every man at his heart, maybe you could say his core sexual identity is as a lover. That's what I'm inviting at least as the picture. And I have this opportunity as a therapist to get this confidential conversation with a lot of men. And it's amazing to me how many men will confess behind a closed door. Guys will say something like, I feel more like the woman in the relationship because I actually want the emotional stuff. I actually need foreplay. I actually want to connect. I know, this was literally in the last couple of weeks, a guy said, I know I'm supposed to just always be ready and always just, sort of get it up and be ready to go. He said, but I actually need that foreplay. Like, I want that. That's the good stuff to me.
Yeah. Sam, I wonder maybe if I can just explore this idea with you of like the monster that is our sexual desire, because I think that what I'm in touch with is essentially these two poles of, like you said, like the goal is to be pure, whatever that means. Basically, don't act on sexual desire. Usually it's like, don't do something. Purity is a lack of sin. Or I'm just afraid of this monster that lives under my bed that's going to, and so there is like this terror that men have of their sexual desire.
Right.
And then if the sexual desire gets expressed or finds release in some way that's undesirable, then there's just shame and guilt.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about how we deal with this fear? Like the fear of being ourselves, the fear of having sexual desire. How do we begin to face that and even move through it?
Yeah. Well, I think you're saying well, right? This idea that purity, if your goal is purity, it sets up this sense of don't have something, right? Stay pure, don't be tainted, right? And it's actually language that my clients will sometimes use to describe their shame. Like I feel tainted or stained or spoiled in some way, right? I feel dirty. And it sets up this tension of like you're saying, wow, there's this fear of what moves in your body, and that everything that moves, right, needs to be held with some suspicion. So if you are around somebody you find attractive, that you probably need to shut down whatever's happening in you and be afraid, because again, this sense of, well, it's every man's battle, so get ready, here's yours, it's coming, right? And I think it really creates this animosity with our own bodies. As I say in the book, we end up repenting of having a body in the means to killing the flesh. On the way to the killing the flesh, we end up repenting of our own body itself and what moves in us. So I'm inviting in the book, just staying longer with what moves in you. And again, back to those pictures of like the lover in Song of Songs, or Adam in the garden meeting Eve, naked and unashamed, right? There's something that moved in these men towards good, right? Poetry being this image of goodness. And so letting, trusting, like you don't have to, it's not an instant, like you're in the ditch of lust. Those aren't the same. Arousal is not the same as lust. Arousal can become lust, but more for what happens in your heart.
Yeah. So can I ask a question about
Yeah.
that? So you're delineating between things that I think often get conflated and confused, right? That arousal or attraction, maybe we could say attraction, is for many Christians, I don't think there's a great understanding or awareness about how that is something different than lust.
Yes.
And you use this phrase of staying with.
Yes.
Could you describe, let's say that I have no idea how to do that.
Yeah.
Or maybe we could just say Ben has no idea how to do that. Ben has no idea how to do that.
In a hypothetical world, some people might struggle with it.
No, how do I delineate between attraction, arousal, and lust? And then how do I stay with attraction if I wanted to?
Yeah. So, if you're a fan of the Bible Project and them walking through, right now they're walking through the Sermon on the Mount. And is it okay for me to bring this up? Another podcast?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
So they walk through the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say, if a man looks at a woman lustfully, he's already committed adultery in his heart. And they said well in the podcast, this idea of a man who goes on looking is kind of how they translated that passage, for the sake of his own sexual gratification. So this idea, again, they're holding something's happening in the heart, not just in the body. So literally in the science of sexuality, I guess you could say, this is coming from a woman, Emily Nagoski. She wrote a book, Come As You Are, but she describes arousal, this idea of arousal non-concordance, which is true of men and women. It's even higher or lower concordance in women than in men. But this idea that arousal, what's happening in your body, is not the same as desire, what's happening in your heart. So you can have arousal and not have desire. You can have desire and not have arousal. and that I know this particularly through the category of sexual abuse, that your body can feel things that your heart doesn't want. Meaning they cannot be concordant, not agreeing, right? So, and Emily Nagoski describes sexuality. Arousal, she says, is more like sexual radar. It's just telling you something sexually relevant is happening.
Yeah.
So you can feel arousal. Again, and this, the horror of even what I'm about to say, that somebody could feel the pleasure of touch in sexual abuse, meaning like if you just, touch your own arm or somebody touches your arm, you will feel the release of oxytocin and dopamine. You will feel some pleasure just by being touched, right? And this is often the thing that damns sexual abuse victims is, well, and even gets scripted by their abuser. You wanted it. Right. And that can feel confusing because there can be a sense of, well, there's something that felt good, right? Either the relational connection or, something of the actual physical touch, but I didn't want it. Right. And so it can feel to abuse victims that my body betrayed me. Right? Because why would my body feel pleasure from such a horrible person or from such a horrible experience? And that can feel very damning. But what's happening there is arousal non-concordance. Your body can feel things that is not congruent with your heart and what you want. So that's a long way to say staying with is just trying to not literally regulating your nervous system as you're feeling whatever's moving in you move in you, and understanding that you have a choice. You could go to lust or you could go to something else. And the something else I say in the book is this category of awe. That you could actually be moved by the person and who they are, and experience some reverence for them. Like I have a friend who was describing to me, he was watching Caitlin Clark in the NCAA Women's March Madness, and he was describing this pleasure he felt in watching her as an athlete, right? And her finesse and her like incredible skill as a basketball player. And he said it's not lust, but then he was stuck, right? Like, why do I feel so drawn to watch her? And almost questioning, like, is it lust? He said it doesn't feel sexual, but what is it, right? What's this other thing, right, that you could do other than look away or lust, right? And I said, I think you're feeling awe for her. She's an incredible player. She's very skilled, and she has a finesse to her shots and how she plays. So this idea that you could actually be moved by a person, and moved with a kind of awe that could actually lead you to worship God, even to say, wow, that's amazing. And even further, God, you make beautiful people. And obviously beauty in a fuller sense than just, physical appearance, right? But the beauty of a whole person and what they bring to the world.
Yeah. You could write a poem about them.
Yes, well said.
Yeah, I love the distinction you're making, and that I just want to reiterate it because it's been so helpful for me, and a lot of what you're saying resonates with some of what I've read from the desert fathers who really thought about temptation and how it actually works in our bodies and in our minds and our hearts and all that kind of thing. And they do like delineate steps that like, and there's like 2 or 3 of them that can happen without sin, like steps of temptation that, and then, their ancient mindset, they talk about it as like the devil, kind of inserting thoughts and, that kind of thing. And even like the entertaining of a thought, even the initial thinking of a thought is like, they went to great pains to say, it's not sin to have the thought. That's what being tempted is. It's not sin to have the thought. It's just temptation. Jesus had those, like he was tempted, and that's just been really freeing, I think, for me and for a lot of other people who have, as you were saying, Matt, conflated temptation with sin, like lust, and it's been really damaging because you're defeated before the battle even begins. Like to actually, and I really like what you're saying, that you can move into awe. You can move into a kind of almost, I mean, you don't want to worship the creation, but there is a worship of God that I think can issue forth from the being in awe of something God created.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think of, scenes where Jesus experienced, very sensual moments.
Yeah.
Like the woman who comes and, bathes his feet with her tears and wipes. And what is it? Pure nard, I think it is, that, pours out the jar of pure nard and bathes his feet. Like, you think about that. That's a very sensual, and I want to emphasize, I'm not saying sexual necessarily, but sensual. His feet are being kissed. He's experienced something of this woman's offering, and his response is, she's done a beautiful thing for me. Right? He's honoring the beauty of what she's kind of ritualizing there with him. And I think, some might say, well, that's because Jesus was, that was a good scene because Jesus was not sexual. But I would say I'm convinced Jesus knew exactly where the line was, where this would cross into sexualizing of her, right? Where it would have crossed into lust. He's letting something of her touch and the beauty of the moment be a gift to him. He's taking in the fullness of what she's doing. And along with what you're saying, lust, in my experience of walking with men, lust, the guys that I walk with who are the most sort of caught in lust or tend to see body parts, right? There's a kind of mutilating quality. They aren't taking in a whole person, right? They're seeing parts that are arousing to them. It becomes very almost, again, my word is mutilating, but it's not humanizing. It's not taking in a whole person, whereas awe steps back and is, that staying with that you talked about, Matt, is that like, I'm going to let the whole of you wash over me.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm noticing, Sam, a lot of what you're naming for us and inviting us into has to do with embodiment. Has to do with being in your body, being aware of your body, being in touch with your body.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could describe. I think one of the major realizations for me in the last decade or so is how disembodied I live, and I wonder if you could describe what does it mean to be embodied, and how do we begin to be at home in our bodies if maybe we aren't.
Yeah, that's good. So, often, again, sitting in counseling, I'll often ask a man, like, what are you feeling in your body right now? Because emotions emotions are really just embodied states, right? We have sensation in our body that gets codified to us as emotion. So anger feels a certain way in your body, and that's how you know you're angry. Or sadness feels a certain way in your body, and we give it a name, an emotion name, right? But those are body states. They start as a body state. And I'll often ask a man, like, what are you feeling in your body? And most of the time at first, they're like, what did you just ask? Like,
Yeah.
and they'll say something like, I don't know, or I'm fine. Like, why would you ask that? Right. And there's a sense of, I know that men in particular are held less as babies and children. And so there's this men receive less touch. So this orientation to the body through affection, right? That's one way we come to know our body. And also I would say in general, men are not invited to stay in their bodies, meaning to stay in touch with is what we mean by that, right? To stay in tune to your body, because we're
grounded in your body, right? Is that a metaphor for that?
Right. That's well said. Right. And you're invited at work to push through, work harder, tune out your tiredness, keep going, and take, caffeine, alcohol, whatever it takes to keep going. My dad is a contractor in construction, and I grew up, working with him, and for a couple years after college worked for him. And I mean, there are men, salt of the earth men, right, that work for him, but there are guys that would go home and put down a case of beer and wake up the next day and push. And these are guys who are working 60, 70 hours a week, right? And you realize to do that, they're having to have something to numb out the body. So I don't know. I don't think that's just particular to men, but maybe it skews that way, right? That men are invited to push through, athletically push through your pain, stay in the court.
I do think there's a cultural narrative or pressure or expectation that a quote real man isn't really in touch with what the body wants or needs, but is able to rise above the body to accomplish, achieve, conquer, etc. Right?
Yeah,
so
that's well said.
Sometimes stereotypically, right? And maybe this is a caricature even, but sometimes stereotypically that comes out in real men don't cry.
Right.
Well said. Yeah. Right. So it gets scripted, right? And there's even a kind of hazing among men, right? Like, what? You need a break, right? Like, or you're tired, right? And this kind of hazing or mocking of that. Well said. And along with emotion then, right? That there's this the unflappable man is the real man, right? That though you're made of flesh, you need to act like you're made of titanium.
It's especially that which we feel in our bodies that makes us vulnerable, right? It's like the only feelings that are allowed again in this script for men is like, you can be angry, but that's an emotion that doesn't feel as vulnerable as sadness, right?
Well said.
It doesn't feel as vulnerable as tears, or even just needing to take a break. That's vulnerable, right?
Right.
And the story just popped into my head. This happened years ago, but I think there was a player on like the NFL team, the Minnesota Vikings, that didn't he die? Somebody died because they just didn't have any water breaks. There was like a practice they had where it was like, this is going to toughen you guys up to not get a water break. And a player literally died because they didn't have enough water, right. So anyway, it feels to me like the theme is vulnerability here. That's what we're not supposed to feel as men.
Right. And I think I remember, didn't Andrew Luck, the quarterback, didn't he get booed out of his own stadium? Because I think he quit for his body.
Yes.
He was like pretty beat up, and he's like, I don't want
this
to lose the rest of my quality of life. Yeah. and he got booed on his last game by his own fans.
That happened right here in Indianapolis. Yeah, we're very, very aware of that whole thing. And yeah, I think it's another example of it. Is just like Andrew Luck's body exists for our entertainment. How dare he take care of himself?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
This is why I wanted you to come on the podcast, because I feel like men need to hear this, but women also need to hear this, that men need to notice and be able to name what's going on in their bodies. And as women, we need to be able to give them the space and the encouragement and to allow them to actually do that kind of work. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
I wonder, maybe just as like a final kind of question, some of our listeners are having the sex talk with their kids.
Yes.
Right. And honestly, I'm one of those people who just, I believe the sex talk happens and it's one long conversation for the rest of their life. Right. Like,
Amen. Right.
the way that I'm talking to my youngest is not the way that I'm talking to my oldest about sex, but it continues to happen. Right. It's an ongoing thing. And so I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do we do this in a way that isn't creepy or awkward or unhelpful? What tips do you have, kind of as we try to help create like a better vision, a better understanding of sexuality?
Yeah. Well, I'll plug this. I actually wrote like a little ebook that you can get as a pre-order bonus. So if you buy the book in advance, there's a little ebook called How to Give a Sex Talk. And I talk about in that. It's short and it doesn't cover everything. You will be left surely with questions, but I try to at least give you a vision for something. The sex talk, like you're saying, it's not one talk. And that's actually some of what men suffer, is they got one very awkward, uncomfortable 2-minute talk and then was over, right? And that leaves something unnurtured, as I say in the book, in a man. I think it's supposed to be, and I'm borrowing this from I can't remember her name right now, but a sex educator. She describes, you got to think of it more as like 100 1-minute talks. They don't have to be, hours of conversation, because, no kid would probably be able to endure that anyway. Right? Like, whoa, time out, Dad. Like, I'm good.
Right.
You never mind. Right.
Well, just the other day I was talking to one of my kids and he said something like, "Mom, what's a threesome?" He had heard somebody talk about it. So I told him, and then he was like, "Okay, you want to play a card game?" Like, it was, it was just like part of life. It wasn't like this, let's have a sit down and like look me in the eye and this awkward thing or whatever. It's just life.
Right. So I think that's the best way to do it, is kind of slake their curiosity thirst and then let them move on. Yeah. And that will build this cadence of, I can bring my questions to you.
Yeah.
I think there's an important aspect of also kind of predicting where their friend group is or where they are in terms of like, can you kind of see the path of their curiosity and maybe speaking, preempting some of that. So, we just had the actual official what is sex talk with our 7-year-old because the questions were going in that direction. And it was like, let's break it to him. So Amanda and I, my wife, we did make that part a little more ceremonial. Like we read this little book and it was, but it was still only like 15 minutes, I think. And he was good. Like didn't really have questions after that. But I think, the sex talk starts when kids are born. You're obviously not talking necessarily about sex, but this idea again of embodiment. I think teaching children their bodies are good and honoring their curiosity about their own bodies and playing well with them, like, learning to play well and help them be embodied to the degree they can. Affection, is huge. So letting them feel the pleasure of good affection, and an affection they can be a part of controlling. They can ask for it when they need it. They can get off your lap when they don't want it anymore. Just learning how to be with their own desire, as children, that's really important. Honoring curiosity is probably more for middle, childhood, older childhood. It's when the questions start to kick in. And then I think, in the teenage years and on, once they're awakened sexually, right? I think it is so important to see it as dialogue. Purity culture really set up this kind of ownership of your children's sexuality, right? Like you're the authority, or, your dad kind of owns your purity, right? Or even your dad, as this, I've heard bad stories of, dads who really force a kind of accountability conversation on their sons. And I don't think that's good. At some level you have to honor it's their sexuality that you're helping them learn how to be with. It doesn't mean you don't have rules about devices or dating, but that there's dialogue. Here's why we're doing those things. And they get to ask questions like, Mom, what's a threesome? Or, I had a friend whose daughter got in the carpool line in the car and said, Dad, and dropped the F-bomb. What does that mean? Right. And so there was a 1-minute conversation.
Right. Oh, so good. Well, I want to encourage listeners to get this book and to read it and to get that ebook for free. And before you get off, tell us how our listeners can find you. What are your pluggables, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The best place is my website, Sam Jolman, JOLMAN.com. That's where you can get the pre-order bonuses. I have a Substack. Love you to follow that. I write on ongoing conversations on men and sexuality there. Those would be the best places.
Awesome. Yeah. Sam, thank you so much for being with us and for your work in this book. Really, really grateful for it.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.